Hey everyone! Tonight we're drifting back to a place most people have never heard of, despite it being the largest city north of Mexico for centuries. We're talking about Cahokia, a sprawling metropolis near modern-day St. Louis that, at its peak around 1100 CE, housed somewhere between 10 and 20,000 people, maybe more. The archaeologists keep revising their estimates, because of course they do. So get comfortable, dim the lights. We're going to spend the next hour and a half wandering through the ruins of America's forgotten city, watching it slowly tear itself apart from the inside. Cahokia doesn't fit the narrative we're usually told about pre-Columbian North America. This wasn't a collection of scattered villages or nomadic hunter-gatherers living in harmony with nature. This was urban civilization, complete with all the hierarchies, inequalities, environmental destruction, and social collapse that word implies. They built enormous earthen pyramids. They had a downtown. They had suburbs. They had astronomical observatories and a merchant class, and presumably whatever the 12th century equivalent of a homeowners association was. And then, by the time the 1400s rolled around, it was gone. Just empty. The great plazas silent, the mounds slowly eroding, the wooden palisade walls rotting where they stood. What happened? Well, that's what we're here to explore. Gently, soothingly, with minimal existential dread. Let's start with what Cahokia actually was back when things were going well, which, spoiler alert, didn't last. The city sat on the Mississippi River floodplain, which sounds like a terrible place to build a major population center until you remember that floodplains are incredibly fertile. Every spring, the river would overflow and deposit fresh nutrients across the fields. The Mississippian people, that's the culture Cahokia belonged to, were master farmers. Corn, beans, squash, the holy trinity of American agriculture, cultivated with enough efficiency to support a genuinely impressive population density. At the center of everything stood Monk's Mound. Yes, that's really what it's called, named after French Trappist monks who lived near the site in the 1800s. Because naming things after the people who actually built them would be too straightforward. Monk's Mound is massive, the largest prehistoric earthen construction in the Americas. Picture a stepped pyramid, 100 feet tall, covering 14 acres at its base. All of it built one basket of dirt at a time, over decades by thousands of laborers who definitely didn't get dental plans. On top of this mound sat a massive building, probably the chief's residence or some kind of temple, maybe both. The point is, whoever lived up there could look down on absolutely everyone else, which was rather the idea. Cahokia was not an egalitarian society. This was a chiefdom, possibly evolving into something even more stratified. There were elites, and there were commoners, and there were probably slaves, and everyone knew exactly where they stood in the pecking order. Around Monk's Mound, dozens of smaller mounds dotted the landscape, each presumably serving some ceremonial or administrative function. Between the mounds, thousands of thatched roof houses clustered in neighborhoods. And surrounding the entire central district, a massive wooden palisade, a wall made of logs with watchtowers every 70 feet or so. Now, you don't build a 2-mile-long defensive wall around your city center because everything's going great. That wall tells us something important. By around 1200 CE, the people of Cahokia were afraid. Whether they feared external enemies or their own restless population is unclear, possibly both. The wall was rebuilt at least 3 times, each iteration getting more elaborate, more desperate, which suggests that whatever they were afraid of wasn't going away. Let's talk about what life was actually like for the average person in Cahokia's heyday, because largest city in North America sounds impressive until you remember that cities in the 12th century weren't exactly paragons of public health. The houses were small, roughly 15 by 15 feet, and housed extended families. So you'd have multiple generations crammed into a space the size of a modern bedroom, sleeping on reed mats, cooking over central hearths that filled the dwelling with smoke because chimneys hadn't been invented yet. During winter, these homes would be dark, cramped, and reeking of wood smoke and unwashed bodies. During summer, they'd be stifling. The fortunate commoners lived in the protected central area, behind the palisade. Everyone else sprawled across the surrounding floodplain in satellite communities, farming the land and, presumably, hoping that they wouldn't be the ones sacrificed during the next religious ceremony. We'll get to that. Sanitation was rudimentary. With thousands of people packed into a relatively small area, waste disposal became a significant issue. Garbage pits have been found throughout the site, filled with broken pottery, food scraps, and human excrement. The water supply, drawn from the Mississippi and various creeks, would have been increasingly contaminated as the population grew. Skeletal remains from Cahokia show signs of malnutrition, particularly among children and lower-status adults, which makes sense. The elites lived on top of mounds, eating the best cuts of meat from deer and turkey, while commoners subsisted mainly on corn. And here's the thing about a corn-heavy diet. It's nutritionally incomplete. Without sufficient beans and squash to balance it out, and there's evidence that commoners weren't getting enough of either, you develop pellagra and other deficiency diseases. The bones tell other stories too. Lots of tuberculosis, which thrives in crowded conditions, evidence of violence, healed fractures, head trauma, and something darker, which we'll circle back to. Around the city, the environment was being systematically destroyed. To build Cahokia, all those mounds, all those houses, all that palisade wall rebuilt 3 times, required an almost incomprehensible amount of timber. The forests for miles around were clear-cut, which meant less game for hunting, which meant more dependence on agriculture, which meant farming more intensively, which meant depleting the soil faster.
It's a cycle we've seen repeatedly throughout history. Civilization plants the seeds of its own destruction, quite literally in this case. By 1200, the city had reached what archaeologists politely call its maximum extent, which is a nice way of saying it had grown as large as it could possibly sustain. The population may have peaked around 20,000, though some estimates go higher. Every available acre was under cultivation. The last nearby forests were being chopped down, the creeks were polluted, food was getting scarce, and the elites, naturally, responded by building more mounds and demanding more tribute. Let's pause here and talk about the belief system that held all this together, because it's absolutely wild and also deeply unsettling. The Mississippian culture was obsessed with the cosmos. They tracked the movements of the sun, moon, and stars with remarkable precision. At Cahokia, they built something archaeologists call Woodhenge, a series of timber circles, like a Midwestern Stonehenge, used to mark solstices and equinoxes. Actually, they built several Woodhenges over time, each one more elaborate than the last, because apparently one ritual timber circle wasn't enough. The elites claimed divine authority, positioning themselves as intermediaries between the earthly realm and the spirit world. The chief, or paramount chief, or whatever title he held, wasn't just a political leader. He was semi-divine, a living connection to the forces that controlled the harvest, the floods, the very order of the universe. This kind of ideology works great when things are going well. Bumper crop, the chief's divine power is clearly functioning. But when the crops fail, when the fish disappear from the rivers, when disease sweeps through the crowded neighborhoods, well, that's when the theology gets complicated. Human sacrifice was almost certainly part of the ritual landscape. We know this from Mound 72, a ridge-top mound excavated in the 1960s that contains some of the most disturbing burial contexts in North American archaeology. In one pit, archaeologists found a mass grave containing 53 young women, all between 15 and 30 years old, laid out in neat rows. Many showed signs of strangulation. In another pit, 4 men had been buried with their heads and hands removed. Nearby, the bodies of several dozen more individuals, men, women, and children,
had been unceremoniously dumped in a single mass grave. And then there was the central burial, a middle-aged man, almost certainly a high-status chief, laid out on a bed of 20,000 shell beads arranged in the shape of a falcon. Around him, various retainers and sacrificial victims, including 6 young people who appear to have been clubbed to death specifically for this burial. Now, the archaeologists debate the exact meaning of all this. Were these human sacrifices? Probably. Were they willing participants in some religious ritual, or were they coerced? We'll never know for sure, but the strangulation marks suggest willing might be a generous interpretation. The point is, Cahokia's elite maintained their power through a combination of religious ideology and, when necessary, spectacular displays of violence. The message was clear: the cosmic order requires sacrifice, and we, the elite, decide who gets sacrificed. This system worked, right up until it didn't. So here we are, around the year 1200. Cahokia is at its absolute peak. Maximum population, maximum mound construction, maximum everything. The elites are riding high, quite literally, on top of their earthen pyramids. And then things start to go wrong, slowly at first, then faster. The first cracks in the foundation were environmental. The deforestation we mentioned earlier had consequences beyond just running out of building materials. Without tree cover, the soil eroded more easily during rains. The floodplain, once so fertile, began losing its topsoil. Crop yields declined. The Mississippi River itself became less predictable. Some years, floods came too early or too late for optimal planting. Other years, the floods were too severe, washing away entire fields. And increasingly, there were droughts, periods when the river ran low and the crops withered. Now, agricultural societies can handle occasional bad years. You store surplus grain, you tighten your belts, you get through it. But Cahokia had almost no surplus. The population was too large, too concentrated. They'd grown beyond the land's carrying capacity, and there was no buffer. When the harvests failed, people went hungry. When people went hungry, they got angry. And when they got angry, they looked up at those enormous mounds where the elites lived, eating stored reserves while commoners starved. And they started asking uncomfortable questions, like, if the chief is supposed to control the cosmic forces that regulate the harvest, and the harvest is failing, doesn't that suggest his power is fraudulent? The elites, faced with this crisis of legitimacy, did what elites throughout history have done. They doubled down. More rituals, more sacrifices, more demands for tribute and labor. Build another mound, rebuild the palisade again. Surely, if we just perform the ceremonies more elaborately, the gods will restore prosperity. Spoiler, the gods did not restore prosperity. Archaeological evidence from this period shows increasing violence, not just the ritualized violence of human sacrifice, but interpersonal violence, bar fights essentially, writ large. Skeletons show more untreated fractures, more head trauma, the kind of injuries you get from blunt force impact, from someone hitting you with a club or a rock. The social fabric was fraying. Some researchers think there may have been a climate shift around this time, a period of cooling and unpredictable weather that made agriculture even more precarious. The medieval warm period was ending, the Little Ice Age was beginning. For a society already stretched to its limits, even a slight drop in average temperature could be catastrophic. Others point to disease. When you pack thousands of people into a crowded urban environment with poor sanitation, epidemics are inevitable. Tuberculosis was endemic. Other diseases, dysentery, various parasites, would have been common. And every few years something worse might sweep through. A particularly virulent flu, a novel pathogen introduced through trade networks. We don't have written records, obviously. We have bones and trash pits in the ruins of buildings, but the bones tell a story of a population under severe stress. By around 1200 to 1250, people started leaving. Not all at once. There was no single catastrophic event that emptied the city overnight. Instead, it was a slow demographic hemorrhage. Families packed up and moved away, seeking opportunities elsewhere. Maybe they went to smaller Mississippian communities downriver. Maybe they dispersed into the countryside and went back to village-scale farming. The
The population decline would have created its own problems. Fewer people meant fewer farmers, which meant less food production, which meant even less reason to stay. Fewer people also meant fewer laborers to maintain the earthworks, to repair the palisade, to perform all the communal tasks that kept a city functioning. The mounds, which had taken decades to build, started eroding. The wooden palisade rotted. Houses were abandoned and collapsed. And the elites? Well, this is where it gets interesting, in a grim sort of way.
There's evidence of burning, not the accidental fires that occasionally destroy a few buildings, but widespread, deliberate destruction. Some of the elite residences on top of mounds show signs of having been torched. Not looted, torched. As in someone decided that the rulers' homes needed to burn and made it happen. Was this revolution? An uprising by the starving commoners against the priestly elite who had promised cosmic order and delivered only hunger and death? Or was it warfare between rival factions of the elite themselves, fighting over the scraps of a dying civilization? We don't know. The archaeology can tell us that buildings burned, but it can't tell us who lit the match or why. What we do know is that by 1300, maybe earlier, Cahokia was essentially abandoned. A few diehards might have hung on, squatting in the ruins of former greatness, but the city as a functioning entity was finished. The great plazas where thousands had once gathered for ceremonies were empty. The mounds stood silent. The woodhenge circles, their astronomical alignments no longer maintained, gradually collapsed. The surrounding fields, no longer farmed, were reclaimed by prairie grass. Within a few generations, Cahokia existed only in memory. And even those memories faded. When French explorers first reached the region in the late 1600s, they found scattered villages of Illinois and other groups, but no memory of the great city that had once stood there. The mounds were just mysterious hills, obviously artificial but with no clear origin story. Early European settlers, seeing the massive earthworks, refused to believe that the ancestors of the local Native Americans could have built something so impressive. They invented elaborate theories about lost civilizations. Maybe the Phoenicians had sailed up the Mississippi. Maybe it was a lost tribe of Israel. Maybe the Vikings. The idea that indigenous Americans had independently developed urban civilization, then abandoned it, was apparently too threatening to the settler colonial narrative that positioned Europeans as bringing civilization to an empty wilderness. So the mounds were plowed over, turned into farmland, used as quarries for dirt. Monks' Mound survived because French monks happened to live near it and because it was too damn big to easily destroy. But dozens of smaller mounds were simply erased from the landscape. It wasn't until the 1960s and 70s that serious archaeological work began to reveal the true scale of what had been lost. And even now, most of Cahokia remains unexcavated. The site is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, but it's surrounded by suburbs and highways. There's a Walmart practically on top of what used to be the southern satellite community. So, what actually happened? Why did Cahokia collapse? The honest answer is, we don't know for certain. It was probably a combination of factors, each amplifying the others. Environmental degradation made agriculture less reliable. Climate change, the end of the medieval warm period, made it worse. Population pressure meant there was no buffer when harvests failed. Political and religious institutions, based on claims of cosmic authority, lost legitimacy when they couldn't deliver prosperity. Violence increased, both from the elites trying to maintain control through force and from commoners resisting. Disease ravaged a population weakened by malnutrition and stress. And at some point, people just left, voted with their feet, decided that life in a collapsing city wasn't worth it, and dispersed to smaller communities where life, while harder in some ways, at least offered a chance of survival. It's a pattern we've seen repeatedly in human history. Civilizations rise, become complex, overextend themselves, and collapse. Sometimes there's a dramatic external shock, an invasion, a plague, but often it's an internal process. The society becomes too rigid, too unequal, too dependent on systems that are fundamentally unsustainable. Cahokia exhausted its resource base. The elites became so disconnected from the commoners that they couldn't respond effectively to crises. And when the system failed,
there was no mechanism for reform, only collapse. There's something oddly comforting about this, in a bleak way. The people of Cahokia weren't stupid. They weren't primitive. They were smart, organized, capable of remarkable feats of engineering and social coordination. They built a city that rivaled medieval European cities in size and complexity. And it still fell apart. Not because they did everything wrong, but because they were trapped in systems, agricultural, political, religious, that worked beautifully under certain conditions and catastrophically under others. When those conditions changed, the systems couldn't adapt quickly enough. The descendants of Cahokia's people didn't vanish. They're still here, incorporated into various tribal nations, carrying forward aspects of Mississippian culture in their traditions and stories. But the city itself, the grand experiment in urban civilization on the Mississippi floodplain, ended. By the time the 1400s arrived, the century we're supposed to be focusing on, Cahokia was already ancient history. The mounds were eroding. The wooden structures had rotted away. Prairie grass covered the plazas where thousands had once gathered. If you'd visited the site in 1450, you would have seen hills, just mysterious, overgrown hills. Maybe you would have wondered who built them, or maybe you wouldn't have thought about it at all. Maybe you would have just walked past, heading somewhere else, somewhere with a future. The silence must have been profound. After centuries of being one of the most densely populated places on North America, full of voices and activity and the constant background noise of urban life, Cahokia was quiet. Just the wind moving through the grass, birds nesting in the trees that were slowly reclaiming the cleared land, the Mississippi flowing past, indifferent, the way it had for millennia before the city was built and the way it would for millennia after. Let's drift back to those mass graves we mentioned earlier, because they deserve a closer look, and because there's something uniquely haunting about them that captures the strange brutality underlying Cahokia's surface grandeur. Mound 72, excavated between 1967 and 1971, wasn't actually a mound in the traditional sense. It was a ridgetop burial complex, relatively low and elongated, and it contained the remains of at least 272 people. That's a lot of bodies. The central burial, as we mentioned, was clearly someone important, middle-aged male, laid out on that elaborate falcon-shaped platform made of shell beads. Around him, a carefully curated collection of grave goods, copper, mica, arrowheads crafted from exotic stones sourced from hundreds of miles away. The kind of stuff that screams important person. But it's the other burials that get unsettling. Those 53 young women laid out in rows. Chemical analysis of their bones suggests they weren't from Cahokia. They were from somewhere else, possibly captured in raids, possibly sent as tribute from satellite communities. Their teeth tell us they grew up in different regions, drinking different water, eating different food. They were brought to Cahokia specifically to die. The pattern of the bones suggests they were strangled, probably with cords, and then carefully arranged in the burial pit. This wasn't frenzied violence. It was methodical, ritualized. Someone, probably multiple someones, had to strangle 53 women, one after another, and then lay them out in neat rows. Try to imagine the psychology of that. Not the moment of killing necessarily, but the hours afterward, arranging bodies, making sure everyone was positioned correctly, all for a ceremony whose exact meaning we'll never fully understand. Were they meant to serve the dead chief in the afterlife? Were they offerings to appease some deity? Were they political hostages whose deaths cemented alliances or demonstrated power? All of the above? The four men with their heads and hands removed pose a different question. Dismemberment suggests something beyond simple human sacrifice. It might have been punishment, executed criminals or war captives, or it might have been ritual murder with specific symbolic meanings about severing the person's ability to act in the spirit world. And then there's the mass grave with dozens of individuals dumped unceremoniously, with none of the care shown to the central burial or even to the young women. These people were disposed of. Their deaths mattered less, or at least warranted less ceremony. What this tells us is that Cahokia had a hierarchy even in death. Some people got elaborate burials with grave goods and ceremony. Others got strangled and carefully arranged. Still others got tossed in a pit. The living society was clearly just as stratified. Here's something that keeps me up at night, in a gentle, drowsy sort of way. We found one mass grave, one burial complex with 272 bodies. Cahokia existed for centuries. How many other burials are we missing? How many other mounds contain similar horrors? Most of the site remains unexcavated. The suburbs and highways I mentioned earlier make large-scale archaeology impossible. So we're working with a tiny sample size and extrapolating from that to understand a civilization that lasted 300 years and housed tens of thousands of people. It's like trying to understand modern America by excavating a single cemetery in Cleveland. You'd get some information, sure, but you'd miss vast swaths of the actual experience. Still, the bones we do have tell consistent stories: malnutrition among lower status individuals, violence, evidence of infectious disease, and periodic mass deaths, probably from epidemics sweeping through the crowded urban center. One particularly grim detail: many of the children's skeletons show signs of porotic hyperostosis, a condition where the skull becomes porous due to severe anemia, usually from malnutrition or parasitic infections. It's not immediately fatal, but it's a marker of chronic suffering. These children lived in a state of constant, low-level hunger and illness, and they were the lucky ones. They survived long enough to leave skeletal evidence. How many others died in infancy and were buried in ways that left no trace? The isotope analysis of bones, which tells us what people ate based on chemical signatures, reveals a stark dietary divide. High-status individuals consumed a varied diet: deer, turkey, fish, along with corn and other plant foods. Low-status individuals ate mostly corn, with occasional supplements. This corn-heavy diet had consequences. Beyond the nutritional deficiencies, it meant that when corn harvests failed, the poor had essentially no fallback. The elite could eat their stored meat and imported delicacies. The commoners starved. Class stratification, in other words, wasn't just about who lived in bigger houses or wore fancier ornaments. It was about who ate and who didn't, who lived and who died. And the elite maintained this system through a combination of ideology. Remember, they claimed divine authority and violence. The human sacrifices weren't just religious theater, they were demonstrations of power, reminders that the elites controlled life and death, that they could take 53 young women and strangle them for a funeral, and nobody could stop them. Until, eventually, someone did, or everyone did, or the system simply collapsed under its own weight.
Cahokia wasn't isolated. It was the center of a sprawling network of satellite communities, smaller towns and villages scattered across the American bottom, the floodplain area between the Mississippi and Illinois rivers. These satellites were politically subordinate to Cahokia. They sent tribute, food, raw materials, labor, possibly people. In return, they received, well, the benefits are less clear. Protection, maybe? Participation in the religious ceremonies and cosmic order maintained by the central city? Access to trade goods? Or maybe they received nothing except the privilege of not being raided. Some of these satellite communities were substantial in their own right. East St. Louis, a site just across the river from Cahokia, had its own mounds and probably housed a few thousand people. But it was clearly secondary. The mounds were smaller, the artifacts less elaborate. This was a tributary, not a rival. As Cahokia declined, what happened to these satellites? Some of them collapsed around the same time, suggesting they were so economically integrated with the center that they couldn't survive its fall. Others seem to have persisted longer, possibly even benefiting from Cahokia's decline. Without tribute demands from the center, they could keep more of their own resources. But the overall pattern is clear. By 1300, the entire Mississippian chiefdom system in the American bottom had fragmented. The grand experiment in centralized urban civilization was over. People dispersed. Some went south, joining or forming other Mississippian communities along the Mississippi River Valley. Others may have moved west onto the plains or east into the forests. The archaeological trail goes cold, which means either they adopted lifestyles that leave less material evidence, or we just haven't found the evidence yet. What's fascinating, in a melancholy way, is how thoroughly the memory of Cahokia faded. When Europeans arrived centuries later, None of the local tribes claimed descent from the mound builders. The knowledge had been lost or possibly deliberately suppressed. There's a theory, speculative but intriguing, that the collapse of Cahokia was so traumatic that the survivors wanted to forget it, that the memory of the great city became associated with hubris, with the dangers of centralized power and divine kingship, that subsequent generations told themselves, "We will never build like that again. We will never concentrate power like that again. We will live in smaller communities, more egalitarian, less vulnerable to catastrophic collapse." If true, that would make Cahokia a cautionary tale, deliberately remembered as a warning rather than as a golden age to be restored. But that's speculation. The truth is, we don't know why the memory faded. Maybe it was just time. 300 years is a long time for oral traditions to survive, especially if there were population upheavals, migrations, epidemics. By the 1400s, the century we're ostensibly focusing on, Cahokia was not just abandoned but forgotten. The mounds existed, but their meaning had been lost. They were just features of the landscape, no more significant than hills anywhere else. And maybe that's the saddest part. Not just that the city fell, but that it fell so completely that even the memory of it vanished. All those lives, all that labor, all those grand designs and cosmic ceremonies and political intrigues reduced to mysterious earthen lumps in a floodplain. Let's gently drift sideways for a moment and think about Cahokia in comparison to other civilizations. In the 12th century, while Cahokia was at its peak, what else was happening in the world? In Europe, the Crusades were in full swing. Gothic cathedrals were being built. The Holy Roman Empire was doing its best to live up to neither part of its name. Population was growing, cities were expanding, and society was stratifying into rigid feudal hierarchies that would define the medieval period. In the Islamic world, the Abbasid Caliphate was fragmenting, but centers of learning like Baghdad still housed some of the world's most sophisticated scholarship. Mathematics, astronomy, medicine. The Islamic Golden Age was winding down, but it was still producing remarkable achievements. In China, the Song dynasty was presiding over possibly the most technologically advanced civilization on Earth. Printing, gunpowder, sophisticated bureaucracy, extensive trade networks. The Chinese economy was booming. In Mesoamerica, the Maya civilization had declined, but new powers were rising. The Toltec were influential. The Aztec Empire hadn't formed yet, but the cultural precursors were there. And in North America, Cahokia. It's easy to compare Cahokia unfavorably to these other civilizations. They had writing systems, Cahokia didn't. They had metal tools, Cahokia was still working in stone and wood. They had wheels, Cahokia didn't. But that misses the point. Cahokia was working with a different set of resources and constraints. They developed sophisticated astronomy without writing. They built enormous structures without metal tools or wheels. They created complex trade networks stretching across half the continent. And they collapsed, just like civilizations with all those technological advantages eventually collapsed.
The Song dynasty would fall to the Mongols. The Abbasid Caliphate fragmented and was eventually destroyed by those same Mongols. The medieval European order would be shattered by plague and war. The Aztec Empire, when it finally formed, would last barely a century before Spanish conquest. Collapse is the norm, not the exception. Cahokia's failure wasn't unique, it was typical. What might be unique, and we're speculating here, is how completely it vanished. European civilizations collapsed, but they left written records. We know their stories, even if only from the perspective of the literate elite. The Islamic world preserved its history through extensive scholarship. China has continuous written records going back millennia. Cahokia left us mounds and bones and trash pits. Artifacts, but no narratives. We have to piece together the story from silent evidence, like archaeologists from the far future trying to understand our world solely from landfills and ruins. In a way, this makes Cahokia more honest. History written by victors is biased. The elites write themselves as heroes, downplay their failures, exaggerate their successes. But bones don't lie. Trash pits don't have agendas. The archaeological record shows us Cahokia as it actually was. Impressive in some ways, brutal in others.
a society that achieved genuine urban civilization and then destroyed itself through environmental exploitation and social inequality. There's no glorious narrative to soften the edges, just the evidence of people trying to build something monumental and failing, which, honestly, is most of human history. Let's talk about trees for a while, specifically the lack thereof. When the first Mississippian settlers arrived at what would become Cahokia around 600–700 CE, the area was forested: oak, hickory, ash, a mixed hardwood forest typical of the region. The Mississippi floodplain was prime real estate: fertile soil, abundant game, fish in the rivers, and timber for literally everything. Timber for houses, timber for the palisade walls, timber for cooking fires, timber for the enormous wooden posts used in the woodhenge circles, timber for scaffolding during mound construction, timber for tools, for art, for ceremonial objects. As the population grew, the demand for timber grew exponentially, and trees, unfortunately, don't grow back overnight. An oak tree might take 50 years to reach a useful size. A really large oak, the kind you'd want for major construction, might be 100 years old or more. So they cut down the old-growth forest. Then they cut down the secondary forest. Then they cut down the new growth before it could mature. And eventually, there were no nearby trees left. This had cascading effects. Without forest cover, soil erosion increased. The floodplain, which had been naturally replenished by seasonal floods, started losing topsoil faster than it could be replaced. Agricultural yields declined. Without timber, they had to import wood from increasingly distant sources, which required labor and organization, diverting resources from other projects, and even then, it wasn't enough. The third iteration of the Palisade Wall, built around 1200, was noticeably shoddier than the earlier versions: smaller logs, more haphazard construction. They were literally running out of building materials. The deforestation also affected the local climate. Forests moderate temperature and humidity. Without them, the region became more prone to temperature extremes and drought, which made agriculture even more precarious. Modern environmental scientists look at Cahokia and see a textbook case of unsustainable development. The civilization grew beyond what the local ecology could support, exhausted critical resources, and collapsed. Sound familiar? It should. We're doing the exact same thing today, just on a global scale instead of a regional one. The difference is that Cahokia's people didn't know what they were doing. They didn't have ecological science or climate models. They saw trees as infinite resources right up until they weren't. They didn't understand that clear-cutting forests would lead to soil erosion and climate instability. We have no excuse. We know what we're doing. We have the data. We understand the consequences, and we're doing it anyway. Cahokia is a warning we're choosing to ignore. But this is supposed to be relaxing, so let's not dwell on impending ecological collapse. Let's drift back to the 12th century and think about something else, like garbage. One of the most informative sources about daily life in Cahokia comes from trash, specifically the communal garbage pits scattered throughout the site. Ancient people didn't have sanitation departments. They dug pits near their homes and threw their garbage in: broken pottery, food scraps, worn-out tools, occasionally human waste. When the pit filled up, they dug another one. Eventually, they might move their house to a fresh location and start the whole process over. For archaeologists, these garbage pits are treasure troves. They contain all the detritus of daily life, the things people used and discarded without thinking about how they'd be interpreted 1,000 years later. From the garbage, we know what people ate. Lots of corn, as mentioned. Deer bones showing butchery marks where meat was removed. Fish bones, mostly from catfish and other river species. Turkey bones. Occasional dog bones, which might indicate dogs were eaten during hard times or used in ceremonies. Plant remains tell us about the full agricultural suite: corn, beans, squash, sunflowers, goosefoot, marsh elder. Wild plants, too, gathered from the surrounding landscape: nuts, berries, various greens. The pottery in the garbage pits is fascinating. Early Cahokia pottery is relatively simple, functional cooking pots and storage jars. But as the city grew, pottery became more elaborate. Decorative elements appeared. Different styles emerged, possibly indicating different neighborhoods or ethnic groups within the city. Some of the pottery wasn't locally made, it was imported from other Mississippian sites, sometimes hundreds of miles away, which tells us about trade networks and political alliances. Stone tools in the garbage pits tell us about the technological skills of Cahokian craftspeople. They made arrowheads from chert, a material quarried from nearby sources, axe heads from dense basalt, grinding stones for processing corn, and needles from animal bone.